I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We've been looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Global Development's panel on the multilateral development banks called Global Challenges Require Global Solutions Transforming the MDB System. I'm Clémence Landers. I'm a policy fellow at the center. And we were very excited for today's discussion, which is an opportunity for us at CGD to kick off our new initiative called MDBs for a Global Future, around how the MDB system can step up in its investments in global public goods, like pandemic preparedness and climate, and to reduce the frequency and intensity of global crises. The MDB model has been remarkably durable for over half a century. But the COVID pandemic and the unprecedented series of global shocks that followed have laid bare the limitations of the MDB toolkit when it comes to tackling crises that defy national borders. The MDBs have historically been primarily focused on individual country priorities, and this makes sense when the mission is squarely focused on domestic growth and poverty reduction, but less when assessed against the investments required to avert catastrophic climate or health events. At the same time, it is inconceivable to think that the international community can meaningfully address the many concurrent global crises we face without a well-resourced and agile MDB system on the front line. There are no other institutions that have the same combination of financial firepower, global reach, and expertise. So the challenge ahead is how to transform quickly these organizations so they are more relevant for today's world. Yesterday, CGD hosted Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who challenged the MDBs, and I quote, to devise new approaches to address global challenges without diminution of their traditional focus on poverty reduction and other sustainable development goals. So the question for us is to arrive at a more precise understanding of what needs to change and how to build and realize a vision for a new MDB system that advanced economies, emerging markets, and low-income countries can all buy into. We have an extraordinary group assembled here today to kick off this conversation. We have CGD Board Chair and former US Secretary Professor Lawrence Summers. We have Manoush Shafiq, Director of the London School of Economics. We have Professor Donald Kaberuka, Chair of Southbridge and Chair of the Global Fund and former President of the African Development Bank, and our very own Masoud Ahmed, President of CGD. One piece of housekeeping before you start: if you have questions for us or for our panelists, please submit them to events@cgdev.org or tweet them at CGD, #CGDTalks, or submit your questions via YouTube. So let me now turn to Larry Summers to help us set the stage for us. Larry, you led a 2016 global report on reforming the MDB system with far-reaching recommendations, including around an ambitious global public goods agenda. But the report was written in a less polarized and more optimistic era, and the world has changed radically since. If you were to write such a report today, what would it focus on? What changes to the MDB system would it advocate for? And in particular, how do you see the global public goods climate agenda now? Larry, we can't hear you.
I'll be heard. Thank you very much for convening this vitally important example of what CGD does best and why I am so proud its board. Let me respond to your question this way, focusing on the World Bank. Security area, World Bank overhaul offers the Biden administration opportunity for a major policy achievement. The World Bank is not a major vehicle for crisis response, post-conflict, and most importantly, support for the huge investments necessary for sustainable development. The remarkable feature of the World Bank's financial model, necessary reform of its financial structure, and even without catalyzed private sector finance, each $1 of appropriated funds from catalyzes a permanent increase in lending of more than $15 a year. Other nations contribute too, and because paid-in capital is leveraged uniquely. The international financial institutions capacity at a low budgetary cost. They are multilateral, and most of their values, and the World Bank is located in Washington and traditionally has. Charles Canny and others at CGD are, on the one hand, meticulous in their numerical detail, on the other hand, searing in their moral content, have pointed out that despite much falling way short in crisis response, despite a policy crisis held on fire, with global recession, high rates, a strong dollar, rising food prevalent pandemic, and climate change, Kenny shows that bank lending global growth since 2017, that it has declined, and that so far the fund has not done much better. This should be unacceptable states and other major shareholders. Given the magnitude of global challenges over the next, should be thinking for the bank in the trillions, not the billions. Important to leave to generals. Financing global survival is too important to leads and international bureaucrats. 4 steps, as generally reflected in the statement that CGD issued yet a group of think tanks, and as suggested in Secretary Yellen's thoughtful. First, there needs to be a general acceptance that the mission of the World Bank must become to fully embrace sustainability and global public goods concerns along with. At the same time, it needs to recognize that the global situation is in the level of investment supported by the World Bank to perhaps $2 trillion a decade. Second, there needs to be a comprehensive overhaul to include more extensive leveraging of the bank's capital, reconsider instruments, including their horizon, the degree of conditionality, financing, IFC, and MEGA efforts to maximally catalyze investment. Consideration should be given to ideas put forth by Mark Plant to use SDRs as capital for development. So far, SDRs, as best I can tell, despite all the ballyhoo, have had essentially impact. Third, there is a pressing need for reform of the bank's culture and emphasize speed of execution. The time will come when the reconstruction of be priority. I hope, but do not expect, that without reform, funds transferred on promised schedules, unlike in so many other nations. More broadly, I hope that the bank can move from what I've once called convoy approach, all sectors in all countries, towards most important in a country by country basis and on a global scale, recognizing that the provision of large amounts of funding in crisis maximum need can be a vital value for countries and global development. Fourth, these three steps in a major green capital increase to be agreed with an increase should, given how dire the world's needs are, be too as the previous $13 billion capital increase in 2018. That a $30 billion increase in paid-in capital, which was only about $5 billion over 8 years, could support $100 billion in annual lending, heavily directed toward. This is more the beginnings of a vision than a detailed, but I hope I have conveyed a sense of the urgency and scale. No doubt, having been long out of a public position, many practical constraints that are so considered in working groups, study groups, high-level panels. Perhaps those consumed by questions of practicality as the IMF and World Bank convene their annual meetings should ponder more people will perish because of the ongoing crisis, perish on Ukrainian soil, and ponder that if the planet is capital investment in new technologies in relatively poor countries, most of the solution. The time for action is now.
Thank you, Larry, for that very clear and ambitious vision. Manoush, let me turn to you, and this follows very nicely off of Larry's final point. You've said that the response to COVID was one of the biggest failures of the international system in your lifetime, and there is a sense that the same is happening now, but in slower motion, on climate, and especially that the World Bank isn't doing enough. What does that mean in practice? What would a successful MDB climate agenda look like? Is it simply a matter of increasing the share of financing going to climate-related projects, or are there also more profound systemic changes within the MDBs that need to occur? And if the latter, what are those changes?
Okay. Well, thank you, Clémence, and I have a lot of sympathy with Larry's opening. I mean, the reason I think the response to COVID was so hugely disappointing was the scale of the economic loss, which now runs to the tune of potentially $12 trillion, was not sufficient to mobilize an international response to the tune of tens of billions, which would have saved the world economy from these huge losses. And we can't even muster up the 10 billion a year we need to address pandemic preparedness. And in some ways, one of the most worrying consequences of this is what's happened to the breakdown in trust between rich countries and poor countries, which is profound. particularly for low-income countries, and I think particularly in Africa, and I'm sure Donald will speak to that, the deep sense that you just don't care about us, despite all the rhetoric about international solidarity. So I think that's a huge problem for the world. Now, I think more financing can help, and I think the G20 review of MDB capital adequacy is a very good start. There are many very good ideas in that report, and we know that we're going to need about, in the case of climate change, about 2 to 3% of GDP more investment in advanced economies and 3 to 5% more for developing countries. Now, you asked whether we need profound systemic change, and I think we do need profound systemic change, but I don't think this is the time to create any new institutions. I think the system is cluttered enough, but we do need systemic change to deal with the failure of the system to cope with global public goods at speed and at scale. I think advanced economies perceive themselves to have very limited fiscal space. And as Larry has pointed out, and as the excellent work by Kenny at CGD has pointed out, the multilateral system is the most efficient mechanism to transfer resources and invest in poor countries because of the miracle of leverage through the MDB balance sheets. But I think the key question for climate change is, how do we change the choice set facing the developing world by making clean cheaper than dirty? And to make clean cheaper than dirty, we need to provide a greater quantity of finance for climate change, and we need the price to go down in order to make debt sustainable. If I had a choice to respond to the challenge that Secretary Yellen gave us yesterday, I would create an IDA for global public goods. And by that, I mean to create, let's call it, like the International Development Association of IDA, I would call it the Global Development Association. And like IDA, which isn't a separate institution, it actually sits on top of and is just a balance sheet that is used by the staff of the World Bank and the IBRD. So you don't need to create a new institution, but you create a new balance sheet specifically to fund global public goods. And it would have the advantage of the kind of leverage that you can get by using an MDB. I would make it accessible to both public sector and the private sector through IFC, so that the IFC could provide private sector financing for things like first loss and guarantees. You could actually start with a new shareholding structure and get away from all those historic problems with quota. And I think critically, the allocation mechanism for resources from this Global Development Association would be based on global priorities. So you would look at the world and say, where would investments in climate change reduce carbon emissions the most efficiently from a global level? And that might be in Brazilian forests or Nigeria's next power plant. But you would allocate, unlike IDA, which allocates according to poverty and policy performance, you would allocate on the basis of globally optimally solving a global problem. You could use this for climate change. You could also equally use such a structure to address pandemics. And so you would put money into those countries to try and avert a pandemic as quickly as possible before it spreads globally. I think this would be a very good way, a very good use of the green capital increase that Larry has described, and provide an efficient, cost-effective mechanism to rise to the challenge that Janet Yellen has raised for us.
Thank you, Manoush. And let me pick up on that point that you made at the top about trust, and turn to you, Dr. Cabruca, because you've been so vocal about the crisis of trust within the international system. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed an international safety net that was badly frayed by the diminishing importance many governments in rich countries attached to issues of international solidarity. And then the legitimacy of the system was further eroded by the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which prompted many African leaders to rightly question why the Western resolve and financial firepower on display in Ukraine is so often absent when it comes to urgent issues in sub-Saharan Africa. This crisis of trust also now clearly represents a major political risk within the MDB system itself. So from your vantage point and perspective, what does an MDB reform agenda that is really focused on rebuilding trust look like?
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Listen, let me try to. The trust issue during COVID was not the first time, simply the acute phase of that diminishing trust. And the limited resources available were not available to all, as simple as that. And one cannot think of to talk about the shareholders of the MDBs. It is to this can do, and all the shareholders of the MDBs want them to do. They are ready. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The shareholders want in Eastern Europe, getting those countries into the market extremely well. So EBRD, you could say, was actually an exemplar of have a clear definition of what they want the institution to do. It does it very well. Regret simply that EBRD, when it had succeeded wonderfully, well, can it extend its mandate to Africa? I think it could have actually done something different. Transited to become the European Bank for Global Public Goods, beginning with Asia, place like that. So this about to set shareholders. Now, once that is clear, the resources, one can argue about how much capital increase these institutions want. Perhaps try to frame it differently. Institutions' business model was not meant to deal with the kind of challenges we face today. Why? Because many of the crises we face now are not in. There was a time when these crises were a result of economic mismanagement or some other internal factors. But when you have the largely in the global system, then we need another solution, not that. We shall need more resources. But even then, even if you triple the capital of the MDBs, would that provide a solution? I think not. Resources available in the MDBs, even if you have increased the capital, is not enough in the private markets. So we then have to ask the question, what is the role of the MDBs? Should they move away from project finance to become more as instruments for pooling risks, de-risking, attracting equity? I think so. Applying their capital would be enough. I think it is more about re-engineering their model. It's possible to make it for countries like in Africa, Southeast Asia, in a much more sustainable way. That will require a lot of rethinking inside the institution. It's either how to use the source of IFC, MEGA, and the rest of it. The final point is about, so suppose you get to these institutions, say you create another resilience trust fund. Okay, so what do you mean those resources? I think again, talking about shareholders, I fear the default position would be attaching so many conditions to it, the possibility of accessing them for the purpose of co-investment, in prevention or in climate. It's a co-investment. Who's going to give a condition? We need to have a discussion with shareholders on a of MDB action. I think it should be around private capital where the money is. That requires governance. You know that those are, but again, as I said about EBRD, one can think about that. One more thing did COVID show? So trust in the global supply chains as well. Not simply loss of trust in the institution. Countries like mine, like others in Africa, open up the market. You can rely on vaccine whenever there is a bit less and less people willing to listen to that argument. So there is trust in the institutions, less trust in the global supply chains. And I do believe that there are two MDBs that are the allied institutions to rebuild the trust in the global supply chains because they go together.
Thank you, Donald, and a lot of interesting points there about the resource pod and private capital mobilization, which I'd like to return to a little bit in the second round. But first, before that, let me turn to Masood. Masood, we've heard a lot today from our panelists about the urgency of changing the system, but it's not always entirely clear that there really exists a consensus amongst shareholders for the MDBs to take on global public goods as a core part of their mandate. Some say that climate change is not a priority for all borrowing countries and that it is difficult to reconcile with the bank's focus on poverty reduction. Others point to the fact that a GPG agenda is at odds with the bank's own demand-driven country-based model, which is a core to its DNA, and will require a level of grants that the system realistically doesn't have the political leeway to generate. So how do you, Masood, square these circles?
Thank you very much, Clemence, and let me just add my own thanks to what you said, to Larry and Minouche and Donald for joining us and for their visions that they've laid out. And as you said, I think, if you listen to the conversation, there's a pretty compelling case that the time is now, as Larry said, for the MDBs, and I would say particularly the World Bank, to take on a much stronger role in terms of helping the world to deal with climate change, with pandemic preparedness, and other public goods. And then there is the resistance to it. And I think the resistance falls into what is just institutional inertia. People don't know enough about it. People are always wary of change. Big machines are hard to shift. There's an internal culture. So let's put that aside for a moment. But then there are, I think, also some fairly genuine concerns people have. And you highlighted a couple of them. And I want to just take on three, which are the most common ones that I hear when people talk about this direction of change and express their worries. And the first one is just to say, look, climate change is not a priority for every country. And my response to that is absolutely right when you're talking about mitigation. And if you're talking about the low-income countries, particularly many in Africa, but not just in Africa, mitigation is not going to be what the priority should be, because collectively their emissions are less than 1% of global emissions, and there is no plausible growth trajectory over the next 50 years where their emissions will make any appreciable difference to where the world ends up. So one of the things I would say is don't do this caravan point that Larry made. Don't try to do emission projects everywhere in the world. Let's focus emissions-related work on the emerging markets, which is where the bulk of the growth in global emissions is going to take place over the next 30 years. And that is where the action is. Very different, however, when you talk about adaptation. Helping countries deal with the impact of climate change is everywhere. I spent last week in Pakistan. A third of the country is underwater. This week, you hear what is happening in terms of drought in the Horn of Africa. The impact of climate change does not spare the poor. In fact, they pay the highest price. So adaptation will have to be a bigger part. I'd also say that IDA, the World Bank's concessional arm, is an important source of development financing for low-income countries, and it needs to continue to play the broad-based development role it does. So let's put that issue very clearly out there. Second reservation or concern people say is to say, look, even in middle-income countries, if you increase the focus on climate, aren't you going to hurt the bank's work on poverty reduction? And I'd say, look, first of all, let's walk away from this abstract statement to look at the specifics of what it is that the bank actually does in middle income countries. Some of the work they do is very directly targeted on helping deal with the remaining pockets of poverty in those countries. But a lot of the rest of the work is very broad based. I took a country example. Let's take a country like Indonesia. The bank has a lending program of about $1.5 billion a year, little over, and it has 49 active projects. They cover everything from decentralized financing arrangements to teacher accountability to tourism development. The World Bank has 300 plus staff in the country working on these areas. Now, I'm sure all of these things are useful and worthy things that need to be done. Some of them, you could argue, have a direct impact and focus on poverty reduction. Others are much broader range of support. And my position is that in a country like Indonesia, if the World Bank were to focus its efforts primarily on helping the country transition away from its current very heavy dependence on coal as a source of energy to an energy mix that was going to be both more carbon friendly and done in a way that was going to look at the social dimensions of that transition. I don't think anybody else is better placed to do that. If you had 80% of the 1.6 billion that they lend and 200 of the 300 staff focused on this for 10 years, at the end of 10 years, I believe you'd be able to show a contribution to development that is actually going to be greater than this wide range of activities over which the current work program is directed. A second point is, 1.6 billion sounds like a lot, but actually in the context of Indonesia, it's not a lot of money. Indonesia's public spending, when I last looked at it, is about $180 billion a year. Foreign direct investment in Indonesia is $31 billion a year. So in Indonesia, as in most middle-income countries, and unlike the situation in low-income countries, the World Bank's contribution and the MDB contribution more broadly is small. When you're small, if you want to have impact, you do two things. You specialize and you leverage, because that is how you're going to maximize your impact. And my proposal, my suggestion is, let's focus on the one or two areas where you can really then try to maximize the private capital flows that Donald was talking about, maximize your impact, maximize your leverage. The third and final point I want to make is the one that you also raised, which is emerging markets won't borrow for GPG projects or for climate projects without grants. And there just aren't enough grants in the system to be able to help make these projects attractive enough for the countries to borrow. And you can't force anyone to borrow money. Now, some GPG projects clearly need a lot of grants. If you're going to do pandemic preparedness, pandemic surveillance, a lot of that will have to be done on grants. Other projects like renewable energy projects, heavy upfront capital cost, long period over which they're paid back. So I think the first point I would make is, yes, we need to recognize that over the next 10 years, we are going to have to put more money, more grant money into supporting climate and other GPGs globally than we're doing now. There's no shying away from it. But 2 points that's worth thinking. First, actually, the world is already spending a lot of grants on climate. $44 billion of ODA every year is focused on climate-related projects. We're also spending money on grants on middle-income countries. There are people who say, well, grants are really for low-income countries. 60% of ODA is spent in middle-income countries. So we all talk the talk, But the facts are that much of what ODA, the majority of ODA is spent in middle income countries already. The World Bank itself, I think over the last 10 years, the last number I got, has $17 billion worth of grants that are given to it for climate related work. So there are a lot of grants already in the system that need to be used more effectively than we're currently using them, including for leveraging some of those projects to do the long-term transition. And the second point I'd make is when we say let's make these projects more attractive, which they need to be, we don't have to first off just reach for more grants. If you were to think of a project like a renewable energy project that has 50 years payback, well, why not make a 75-year loan at 2% over prime, which the World Bank could go out and borrow today and be able to do today? Why not do that? And I would posit that for most emerging markets, that kind of financing terms is a lot better than they could go out and get for themselves, and a lot more attractive, and would be quite happy in many cases to move forward with that for some of the transitions that they themselves want to make. And that's what I want to end on, which is this whole notion that somehow you have to convince emerging markets and developing countries to make the transition is a little bit patronizing, in the sense that if you go talk to emerging market leaders, they are just as committed to a future without climate change because they are today bearing the cost. And I think what we have to do is to facilitate that rather than assume that they're unwilling partners in this exercise. And I just end by saying that in all of this, the point that Minouche and Donald raised about trust, if you don't have trust in the system, no matter what you do on grants, no matter what you do on terms, it's going to be a much harder sell. So I do believe that the trust is the bedrock of moving forward with this agenda. Thanks, Clem.
Thank you, Masood. And your points on financial impact are very well taken. And I'd like to move a little bit from financial impact to financial efficiency. And we've touched upon, but I'd like to touch upon a little bit more the recent capital adequacy review commissioned by the G20. And Larry, maybe point this question towards you about the capital adequacy review, which has put forward a series of pragmatic reforms that together could increase the financial firepower of the system, potentially by hundreds of billions of dollars over time, and relax, and that amount of money would help relax a lot of the trade-offs we've discussed today. But paradoxically, there's quite a bit of resistance from some of the MDBs themselves to the implementation of this review. Do you think, in your view, do MDBs have the balance right between prudent and efficient capital management? And what do you think shareholders should be telling the MDBs to better align their finance priorities with their risk tolerance?
Look, if to leave to generals, finance is too important to leave to, obviously, one needs to be careful and prudent in these things. One needs to pay attention to and the like. But I would suggest that dogmas should hold, and that if there is some very created of non-paid capital being called the end of the world. The finance complex of these institutions is to maintain the warmth with their lenders. The motivation of their shareholders is to create a better world. So I am not in a position to cite details or to argue with the relevant accounting figures or the details, but I do believe that reason why the shareholders need in fear before these agencies, even with the recent developments, there is expect that we are over the next era in a lower real interest rate world than the era, and that has a profound effect on credit, has a profound effect on the acceptability of, just as the Maastricht criteria were for the nominal interest rate in Germany, it was 9%, and the real interest rate was 4%. And those don't seem the relevant guidelines to use today, something by the Japanese experience. I would suggest a more modern view. That does not mean turning to anti-poverty or green, but I think there is room to strike a different that has been struck. My understanding is that the Capital Act was unable to put forward a give estimate, even in the form of a range of the number of in extra funding that would be catalyzed by carrying out its recommendation using words rather than numbers. That would be unacceptable. And so just as the appropriate relation between civilian and military figures, where the military figures have expertise on tactics, civilian leaders, that ultimate responsibility falls in countries like some similar idea needs to inform questions.
Thank you, and I will remember the metaphor between military and civilian leaders. It's an apt one. Donald, maybe we could move to a little bit from the hard loan windows to the concessional windows and talk a little bit about the future of these windows themselves. In particular, the concessional lending windows have been a relative bright spot in the MDB system. During the COVID-19 crisis, IDA was actually able to surge its lending quite significantly to meet demand. And the concessional windows have also experimented with innovative financing mechanisms, like some of them have a regional window or refugee windows that have allowed them to address cross-border challenges and finance global public goods through price and volume incentives. But as we know, the model relies extremely heavily on regular donor infusions. And the African Development Fund has actually gotten smaller since your days there. And IDA has only been able to grow because of its own internal resources and not an expanding pot of donor funds. So can I ask you to reflect a little bit on how you see the future of these windows? And just before you answer this question, it might be good if you could go turn off your camera for this, because we were having a couple of connectivity problems last time, and I think we might hear you better if you speak without the camera on. So over to you, Dr. Kabruka. Dr. Kabruka, I think you might be muted.
I'm not muted.
Okay, go ahead.
Wonderful. Look, before I answer your question on concessional finance development banks, because part of getting a new architecture in shape, well, as Larry and Masood are suggesting, to figure out exactly what the role of regional development banks, because they have vast experience, and that seamless link between what would be called upon to do and what regional institutions do is very important. In the European Bank for Reconstruction Development, okay, if he has a good one, it should be closed down. All right, as I said at the beginning, maybe should have, you were mentioning climate change in parts of Eastern Europe Central Asia. But the bank, which was showing that one, there's clarity of mandate, is able actually to complement. Look, I could say the same for the African Development Bank, which of things across the continent. So we need to think about that architecture, not simply the ones. Now, on concessional finance, over 60 years, concessional finance has been the most stable source of external finance following income country. In fact, the numbers I saw last time I looked at it, which was a few months back, CD reports were now at about $170 billion. One, I think. How much of this is real money? How much of this is double counting? I need to check that. But of the many things I do, Masoud, as you know very well, I'm at the board of the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis. And we have just management for this fund in New York under the chairmanship of President Joe Biden. We did quite well in the circumstances, $14.5 billion. What we actually wanted. Because two countries, the G7, were absent from the table for reasons of domestic politics or some other issues. But it was the first time we were actually absent. So the question to ask is whether it is either, whether it is the vertical concessional finance going. The chances are, if we are just for double counting, we reached a plateau. And if it has reached the plateau, and to be compete measures like Ukraine, like increased defense spending in Europe, like secure different space. And we have to think carefully, not in terms of the volumetrics of the, but how actually do we best deploy the limited concessional finance available. There'll be a lot of creative thinking to do. Not in contradiction with fighting poverty more effective with less resources available. We need to begin by making the assumption that ODA probably, look, the new UK government has walked away from 0.7, but not just the UK, 6 other countries, ODA is down by about 20, and these are some of the major donors. And again, with what is going on in Eastern Europe, I suspect with defense spending, with Ukraine reconstruction, with energy security, less of it. So if we agree that there be less of it, how do we best deploy it? Purposes of which we are discussing. This, for me, is one of the biggest questions with the entire architecture system. Not simply imagine that for some, if it was going to increase, I would have seen it in the replenishment of the global fund, because this pandemic, you'd have thought at least financing for global health would have attracted that. Now, it didn't, because of the reasons I mentioned. Although I must say here, the President of the United States was incredible, because he actually went beyond it and encouraged other G7 countries to do so. Canada, Germany, France, to mention those. They all went up by 30%. Sense of 2 G7 members is indicative of the kind of terrain we're entering. The question is, how best do we use less for more in the future? Leverage banks, the vertical funds, the World Bank. I wish I had an answer how this can be done, but it's something we'll have to think about. Over to you.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you for pointing us to the Global Fund. I think some important lessons for the broader MDB system from that replenishment, and certainly the level of political attention and support it received. Manoush, let me turn back to you. I wouldn't be a panel on global MDBs without the perennial question of the division of labor between the MDB system, the World Bank in particular, and the IMF. And this is especially true in recent years, where there's becoming increasing overlap between the two structures. You've been part of both institutions, and how do you think that the MDBs can best work in today's world with the IMF on climate financing and crisis response in general?
So I think the most important thing the IMF can do to help on the climate response is to help address debt sustainability and fiscal space. It is laudatory that the fund has done what it can in terms of emergency response to things like the pandemic and to resilience funding and that kind of thing, and particularly for things like natural disasters associated with climate, and that is good. But I think, as Masood said, climate finance is a very long-term business. These are projects that have rates of return which are spreading over 50 years. That is the MDB's business. It is not the IMF's core business. So while the IMF can help, particularly in setting up the fiscal framework to make this finance work, I think we need to look at the MDBs for core climate finance. If Oxford University and McDonald's can borrow for 100 years, why can't the World Bank? And why can't the World Bank lend for more than 30 years for projects that have rates of return that are much, much longer? If we're going to fix climate change, we have to take that longer term perspective. Some might say, what's the point of having a AAA balance sheet when we've got a sub-investment grade planet? And it seems to me that the question of risk is a choice for the shareholders, not for the institution. I also think, I used to run the balance sheet of the Bank of England, and your decision about risk tolerance can change over time depending on the context. If you're in a crisis, you have higher risk tolerance to get yourself out of the crisis. And central banks all over the world have taken on a lot more risk than they ever have historically to deal with crisis circumstances. And I think it is also a legitimate question to say, at this juncture in history, when the need for climate finance is so high, the next decade we know is critical. The choices that the emerging markets will be making on the investment decisions around energy, transport, urbanization. This decade, as has been said by many, is the critical decade. And we may well decide that we have a higher risk tolerance for the next decade if we really want to shift those investments in a cleaner direction. So I would put my focus on that. And I think making the case, as Larry was pointing out, about, and as Donald has said, if resources are scarce, you use the most efficient channel. And the most efficient channel are the MDBs because of the wonders of leverage and being able to partner with others. And so I think that's the case that we need to be making right now.
If resources are scarce, you use the most efficient channel, which I think is an excellent takeaway for this panel. I realize we're starting to reach the end of our time, and Masood, I wanted to turn to you to maybe offer some of your reflections and a little bit of a wrap up and a way forward for us on all of this.
Thank you, Clémence. What I would suggest as a way forward is three things, perhaps. First, we have the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF coming up next week. On the agenda is how far the World Bank's focus on global public goods, on climate, needs to be articulated in a statement of its objectives. And I don't know where they're going to come out, but I do see one dimension of work over the next year is to build a broader base of shareholder support for this direction of change. So far, I think it's fair to say that the momentum behind this agenda has been more amongst the rich countries, and there is a process underway in the World Bank board that engages a broader range of executive directors, I understand, but I think the time is now to make a concerted effort to try and come up with a common vision that everybody buys into and is ready to take forward. And I think the elements of that are there. It's a job that needs to be done. The second track on which I do feel work needs to be done over the next year is to take forward these various proposals on how to mobilize more funding for the MDBs to be able to lend more with some combination of better use of their existing capital. And also, I think we need to be upfront about putting on the table that this will also need additional injection of capital in the form of some kind of capital increase or guarantees that would allow the institutions to move forward. Because I actually believe that the promise or the prospect of additional shareholder support through additional money is needed to really exploit the potential of using existing capital more effectively and to take that risk. I mean, the risk tolerance has to be set by shareholders, as Minouche said, but the two parts go hand in hand. And at the moment, there is a little bit of a sort of shadow boxing going on between the MDB saying we can't really use capital more efficiently, the house of cards all falls down if you do touch anything, and the shareholders saying, everything has to be done by rejigging your existing capital. Don't talk to us about new capital and raising. And I think that's not a very productive conversation. So we need to move beyond that and have a real conversation that includes both. But I do also worry that on the capital adequacy framework, there are some quite technical proposals, some of which are easy, some of which are harder. Sometimes the bigger payoff is actually in the harder recommendations. And the risk is that this whole thing can go into the long grass with people sort of doing lots of detailed work, at the end of which a mouth will emerge. And I think we need to just make sure that the shareholders are engaged. And I personally believe that it also requires some independent external capacity to be able to keep looking at the implementation of these proposals. The third thing I would say is that we need to make an effort on all sides to not put up false choices. False choices are unhelpful in advancing this debate. And one of the things you always hear very much is, this kind of, it's development versus climate. And it's not development versus climate. We all know that it's not development versus climate. And we just need to find ways where there are genuine trade-offs to address the genuine trade-offs. And similarly, as I say, I think we have to be willing to tackle some of the existing practices. I think Donald said this at the end, we have to use our resources most effectively. I would say grants are the most precious of resource, right? It's the resource in shortest supply, for which every $1 of grant, there are $10 of claimants out there, all wanting a bit of that grant. But we don't really use them as effectively as we could. And so I think this is also the moment to see how we can use our existing resources, and particularly existing grants. And I do worry sometimes about the overheads and management that have come into place by creating so many multiple structures to process quite small amounts of money through each one of them. And if you add them all up, honestly, you'd begin to wonder as to why we don't have a more effective, more efficient structure of management and governance. Each one of them has separate governance overhead. So this takes us to a whole different area, but those are just some thoughts of follow-up work. So from me, thank you, Clem.
Well, thank you so much, Masood. And I really, on behalf of CGD, wanted to extend our thanks and gratitude to our panelists. This has really just been a very rich discussion, and I think that reflects the urgency of the moment. But I also think really has helped provide us at CGD, and I hope our audience, some strategic direction in terms of how we think about these issues. We at CGD are going to be putting out several papers and publications digging into both the strategic framework, the missions, but also some of the nitty-gritty of these issues and how they play out operationally. So please follow that work. The program is called MDBs for a Global Future, and we have a website on our CGD page. So if you just go to MDBs for a Global Future, you can already see some of the papers that we've put out. And we look forward to staying engaged. And if you're in our audience, please see our list of annual meeting events. We have many more events on the MDBs and their role on these global existential challenges of our time. So thank you again, and we look forward to more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.